Tonight we'll be hearing from Associate Professor Adam Smith and Dr Paul Hardisty, who will be discussing the positive differences being achieved at multiple scales through reef conversations. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we're meeting this evening. For myself here in Brisbane, that's the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Before we dive into the content tonight, just a quick reminder that RGSQ has a diverse program of events, and we have several of those upcoming over the next month. For those that haven't already, the photo competition is still open, focusing on geographic icons of Queensland. That's now closing on the 11th of October, so time is running out to get your entries in. We have a map group talk coming up next week, looking at the Burke and Wills expedition, and then that evening, the RGSQ 2024 annual general meeting. If you haven't, as a member, voted already, please do, or if not, come along to the AGM. We'll also have a special talk focused on one of the research projects we've funded over the past 12 months. At the end of this month, we have our panel discussion, Geography and Conversation, this month focused on urban greening and linking into the project that we're doing with the Spring Hill Community Group. Early next month, we once again have our monthly lecture, and we will have our Geography Matters again, similar time to now. With all that said, please do check the website for upcoming events and details, and to register your interest to attend virtually or in person. With that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers for this evening. Providing us with insights is Associate Professor Adam Smith, who's the founder and Chief Executive Officer of Reef Ecologic, an Australian-based company and social enterprise that provides research and monitoring, strategic advice, and capacity building to facilitate sustainable outcomes. Adam holds the Bachelor of Science Honours, PhD and MBA, and has authored over 100 scientific papers, books and reports. In his leisure time, he's a keen ocean sportsman, naturalist, free diver and kayaker. Joining him tonight is Dr Paul Hardisty, who's a scientist and author. He was CEO of the Australian Institute of Marine Science from 2017 to 2023, and his most recent non-fiction book, In Hot Water, Inside the Battle to Save the Great Barrier Reef, is in bookstores now. He's also the author of 7 novels, including the best-selling thriller The Descent, which describes a near future affected by climate change, and its sequel, also called The Descent. Do check your notes, I'm sure we've got it somewhere. With that though, I'll throw straight to you, Adam, to provide us with more.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome everyone to the Geography Matters webinar series that has the topic, and it's quite a mouthful, we're going to change the world through reef conversations. So to start with an introduction, when it comes to changing our lives or changing the world, it all begins with a conversation. Alone, we humans are often weak, disempowered, and quite frankly, easily stumped by obstacles. But if we talk about it and we work together, we're capable of extraordinary results. And that really is what we're going to talk about today. It's not just what we talk about, it's also every word we put into the world, each question we choose not to ask, each conversation we choose not to have, aggregates to a lifetime's worth of impact or disappointment. So that's what we're keen to discuss, and we're going to dive in to the wonderful world of coral reefs. Now, I'm starting with a formula that changed my life. I was invited to give a TEDx talk almost 10 years ago in Townsville, and I decided to talk about reef revolution. And one of the key elements of this rare formula change is the importance of interpersonal communication. Now, all of them are linked if you want to get a result, such as a conservation result. And interpersonal communication is something we're talking about today. And I guess to try and personalize it even further, the man who I think does it better than anyone else is almost 100 years old, and I think everyone's familiar with Sir David Attenborough. And I've been given a little bit of a bio and it's about my degrees and all that sort of stuff. Well, I wanted to be a bit more accountable to you, the audience. And my ecological footprint is 1.8 Earths, which isn't good enough. We've only got one planet. But I do try and be the best I can be. And the small business that we've formed has a vision for a better planet. We're certified as a B Corp and we rank fairly highly. So there might be some questions about B Corp, but it's one of the best metrics we've found in order to measure your businesses. Like a lot of businesses, we measure things, and I'm a small business, 6 staff, interns. We train a lot of people, but this talks about communication. And we have measured that we reach about 10 million people a year and have a social media reach of almost 800,000 people. And we generate other communication vehicles through awards, reports, scientific papers, and we also report on our citizen science observations. But let's get to coral reefs. They really only are pretty focused. 1% of the marine habitat of planet Earth or planet ocean, here indicated in red. And I think most people would know the Great Barrier Reef is the largest and arguably best managed coral reef in the world. Even though they only take up 1%, they can potentially have huge benefits and also huge risks. And they say that over 1 billion people rely on coral reefs, either for food, livelihoods, but this graphic is really talking about coastal protection. And you can see in the icon down below that that applies to almost all of Australia and places like India and Indonesia. So that's a huge benefit, but also a potentially huge risk if things change. And things are changing. NOAA is a world authority on things like coral and sea surface temperature. And this beautiful graphic is also a very scary graphic because it talks about coral bleaching alerts globally. And the colors, the key down the bottom, you can see there's not much no stress on our planet. Most of the colors are yellow for watch, orange for warning, red for alert, and even some really high level alerts, alert level 4 or 5. And that's the advice over the last year. Let's look a little bit to history here. And this is a graphic, and I've tried to find as simple a graphics as I can for a diverse audience of scientists and communicators and the general public that looks at hard coral cover and sea surface temperature. And the blue line going from my left to right is hard coral cover. And back in the 70s, it was around 34%. And in around the year 2000, it dipped down, recovered, and now it's dipped down again by 2020. And you can also see those large areas of red that seem to be increasing in frequency. They're high sea surface temperatures and rapid increases in temperature linked to potential coral bleaching. The other interesting thing from this graphic is the spread of the data was very broad in the early days, but it's becoming more precise over time, of course, with technology. Now, when most of us think of coral reefs, we think of beauty. You know, they're colorful, they're diverse. We think of tourism, but they support thousands of species of fish and coral and algae. And then they also have some bad sides. And one of my favorite reefs offshore Townsville is John Brewer Reef. And when I was diving it 5 or 6 years ago, that reef was very much like the one we just looked at, beautiful and biodiverse. But because of cyclones, warm water, crown of thorns starfish, and also some human impact, it's a little bit damaged today. So why? This next slide, I suppose, tries to get you thinking and asking questions about politics, people, the environment, and a word that's very dear to me is leadership. And I'm sharing a quote from Professor Terry Hughes, who almost 10 years ago said, when are we going to stop pretending that +2 degrees is safe for the Great Barrier Reef when +1 degrees already bleaches 93% of it? So there's been a lot of conversations about the reef and its changes. And I guess in order to try and make this talk personable, I'm 60 years old now. So when I was born, the Prime Minister of Australia was Robert Menzies. Now we've got Anthony Albanese. When I was born, there was 3.2 billion people on the planet. Now there's 8.16 billion. And when I was born, one environmental indicator is parts of CO2 per million. It was 318, and now it's 422. Now, though that's only a number, scientists have a threshold that healthy coral reefs need about 350 parts per million or less. So we've gone past that threshold, and it looks like it's going to continue to climb. This one's a bit of a challenging graphic because I often have conversations with people both in Australia or overseas about, what do they care about? And a lot of people care about their family, they care about their job, their salary, they care about sport. But do they really care about the environment? Well, the numbers say yes, that 93% of us are concerned about the environment, but it's really interesting as to whether those numbers translate to behavioural change or action. And we'll drill into that in a minute. And it's pretty powerful, that image of Mel Gibson when his football team loses, compared to a lot of us are sheep. We let the government and others just railroad us in terms of environment, business, and a whole lot of other things. Look, the reef means different things to different people, and I'm very privileged to live in Townsville, which is right in the centre of the Great Barrier Reef, and I'm able to visit it regularly. Swimming, kayaking, scuba diving. It's my work, it's my hobby. I love it. But tourists see the reef very differently to scientists, very differently to traditional owners, and sometimes very differently to businesses, including ports and shipping and mining and defence and so forth. But it's been there for a long time. And I suppose the other thing is to try and look at it in different ways. And this is quite a powerful infographic, that we rely on the rainforests, obviously, for clean air and the oxygen we breathe, but we also rely very heavily on the oceans and healthy marine ecosystems for the air we breathe and all the sustainable resources that they generate. What is a conversation? This is where I was really challenged for this talk. I'm much more comfortable with scientific methodology, but I thought I'll make a bit of a stretch. I'll see who else has done research and what's out there. So this is one of the theories of a conversation. You have to have a shared language. You have to have multiple partners. You have an exchange of words or communication. A successful conversation has an agreement. And most importantly, it should have an action according to this theory. That's one view. Here's another, and I've taken this from a more recent publication, including from the IPCC, the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change Handbook for effective communication. And you can have a read of that, be confident, talk about the real world, not abstract, connect with what matters to your audience, tell a human story, lead with what you know, and use the most effective visual aids. So I'm trying to follow both of those metrics. And when I put this talk together, I noticed that something's missing in the IPCC. In my view, number 7 should be some sort of behavioural change or action. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects that are all quite different, that are all very personable to me, that you might like to know about. And one of them was a citizen science expedition of the Great Barrier Reef and Coral Sea. And this came about because I was contacted by Coral Expeditions, which is a tourism company based in Cairns, and they were supported by Australian Geographic. And I was able to bring together 6 amazing people from different walks of life to share their Great Barrier Reef stories with about 40 guests. And the guests were generally elderly people, because this trip is not cheap, but the youngest was 11 and the oldest was 88. And most of them were pretty new to the Great Barrier Reef and citizen science. We had 5 aims, to share knowledge, to make it a real scientific partnership, genuine science outcomes, including reports and scientific papers. And I've highlighted communication through diverse channels, including art, videos, web, news, and social media. And it's number 5, but we're also really keen to have some discussions about climate change and do something that might make a difference to get some fundraising to support a carbon neutral expedition. So the vessel left Cairns. We travelled north for a couple of days, as far north as Lizard Island. And then because of cyclonic weather, we headed back south. By about day 6, we were off Mission Beach, day 7 off Townsville. We then headed out to the Museum of Underwater Art at John Brewer Reef, Myrmidon Reef to dive a shipwreck, and then a place where very few people ever get to go because it's that far offshore. It's over 200 nautical miles offshore. We went out into the Coral Sea Marine Park, and we spent 4 or 5 days out there before returning to Cairns. And just about every day, we shared knowledge, we had lectures, we talked to the guests, we breathed, we relaxed. Here's one of the quotes from a doctor on board who said, you nailed it. He called us educators. He didn't call us scientists. He called us educators and leaders. We were inspirational, kind, intelligent, and professional. And I hope we changed his 11-year-old daughter's life. And I've tried to also communicate this first project according to 3 columns: inspire, impact, and influence. And I did that because we presented to a conference and they were the themes for the conference. So the easiest thing is to inspire the people that are there, who you can see face to face, who you can go snorkeling with, who you can teach. But you can also indirectly inspire families through conversations, NRM, Natural Resource Management Partners, and we were lucky to share this story with about 500 people from a conference. Measuring impact can be done lots of different ways. There were lots of lectures, 15 of those. We had over 8,000 observations. We used a whole lot of different methodology. We did some social surveys of the guests, and really pleasingly, most of them were really happy with the cruise, the experience, what they learnt, and often gave scores of 9 out of 10 or more. And there was an economic benefit for the cruise ship company. And in terms of influence, we measured that through media releases, articles, social media, partnerships, and influencing other citizen science expeditions. And not only myself, but several other people from Townsville presented to the Citizen Science Oz conference on the sunny coast. So there was a real multiplier effect. Project 2, Museum of Underwater Art. Well, it started as a crazy idea in 2017 when we were lucky to have another scientist from Mexico talk about his underwater museum. And we talked to an artist, we raised some money, came up with a plan, and we installed it. And it's a large 160-ton coral greenhouse with 8 sculptures that represent ocean sentinels. And it's to try and showcase reef scientists, reef conservationists, both from history and now, showcase Townsville as a marine city and a world leader in marine science and marine park management. And through various media campaigns, we've been successful in reaching an unprecedented 184 million people. Its impact has been more than just one-dimensional across tourism, art, culture, and science. An economic study has shown that it's generated about $20 million in terms of accommodation, tourism, etc. It's the only underwater museum in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's the largest and a Guinness World Record for underwater sculptures. And in order to cross the boundary between science and sport, we had the Australian Olympic artistic swimming team out there, some of them for their first ever experience in a coral reef, which was pretty cool. And there's been lots of stories, some of them told by the local Indigenous groups, local papers, and even a video. And I believe that the amazing lady from New York who put together this video is online. So I look forward to her sharing where she's at now and what this video meant to her during her trip to the Great Barrier Reef. And my third and final project is pretty interesting. You know, I'm a fish biologist largely. So what am I doing talking to people from Department of Defense? Well, I was invited to their annual meeting where they have up to 20 different defense countries mixing with scientists, non-government organizations sharing knowledge. And they asked me to talk about the Great Barrier Reef. And then I must have made a bit of an impact. So they asked me back for the next couple of conferences as well. But while I was there, I learned a lot and I asked questions. I was very curious. And I said, why are you doing that that way? And defense has a potentially huge impact. If you look at this graphic, the US military generates more CO2 emissions than most countries. I think it would be the 43rd biggest emitter in the world if it was a country, but it's way bigger than Peru, Sweden, and New Zealand. So I said, well, if I go to a science conference, we try and make it carbon neutral. Have you thought of that? And they said, no, but we'll do it. Let's measure it, offset it now. So they were very respectful and they've done some good things, but it's only a drop in the ocean and we need to get them to do a little bit more. So using the same formula for the previous 2 projects, inspire, impact, and influence, I guess I've recognised that this is still fairly early on in the relationship with defence. I've written a couple of scientific papers to get some knowledge out there. I've attended some conferences and talked to people, but we haven't broken down the barriers yet. We haven't come to the real actions. So watch this space. I'm also very grateful for the support of James Cook University in putting out a media release in September to again communicate this important idea, this important work. And look, my final slide before handing over to Paul is meaningful conversations and the time and resources to have them with the right people enables and empowers people and organizations, and we can change the world. Over to you, Dr. Paul Hardisty.
Thanks very much, Adam, for an inspiring talk. I think we could probably stop sharing the screen. I don't need to see pictures of me. We're here really to to discuss Adam's presentation. And look, I met Adam probably, it would have been about 10 years ago now, or so, 8 years ago, and when I first started as the CEO of Ames in Townsville, and he and his colleagues invited me to come up, and we had a wonderful evening with some of the people that they had on a course that they were giving from around the world on environmental leadership and reef leadership, and we had a great discussion over some fish that you had just caught, I think that day, Adam, spearfishing, and we had a conversation about leadership in this area, right? How do we change things? And a lot of the people I remember that were in your house there for that beautiful meal were from overseas, from small island nations, from Pacific nations, from Indian Ocean nations, and they were all facing the same kinds of challenges. And in the end, I think leadership is about communication. So that's my background with Adam, and I was on that citizen science cruise with him a little while ago, which was delightful as well. So Adam, I'm going to kick off some questions, but I'm going to invite the audience to get onto the chat, and if anything that Adam said has sparked some thoughts or some questions for Adam, or just some comments that you'd like to share, I will keep an eye on the chat and share them back and deliver them to Adam in the form of a discussion question. But Adam, I'd like to start out by just backing up towards the beginning of your presentation, where you were brave enough to have measured your own footprint in terms of carbon emissions only. I'm assuming that wasn't water, nutrient cycle, biodiversity loss, all the other forms of footprint. It was just CO2, right?
Look, you do measure everything. This particular metric looks at the house you live in, the food you eat, the travel you do, and it comes up with a couple of different indicators. One is number of planets, and the other is CO2 equivalent emissions.
Okay, so it's a broad-based. So that's fascinating, and again, it's something I'm going to come back to. But it's pretty brave to sit up there and put it up and say, yeah, this is me, and I'm 1.8, so I'm living beyond really the carrying capacity of the Earth for an individual. And I was wondering, when you did that work, do you have any insight as to what the Australian average is? You said you're at 1.8, your company is neutral or below neutral, so you're doing really well there. But what's the average Australian? Do you know?
I do, and you're not going to want to hear this. The average Australian has a footprint of about 4 planets. The average American about 6 planets. In order to find a really sustainable country, you often have to go to some of the developing countries, such as, the third world countries that, live a lot simpler and a lot more sustainably.
So to bring that into context with some of these island reef states who arguably have more to lose than anyone, well, certainly when we talk about the loss of coral reef potentially around the world due to all of the impacts that you mentioned, climate change, the effects of overfishing, of tourism, of crown of thorns, starfish, etc. They're probably quite low in terms of their overall impact, people who live in those countries. Are they not? Do you have any?
They are indeed. They're low, they're the most vulnerable, and they're going to be the most impacted. And look, also, we don't have to look too far afield to the Torres Strait Islands. They're in a very similar situation to some of those low-lying countries in Vanuatu or Kiribati or Tonga.
No, thanks, Adam. I'm just checking the chats here. So far, we haven't had anyone join in, so I'll keep the conversation going. It's all about conversations today, so please do join. We'd love it. We'd love to hear from you and get you involved. I'm going to plug my new book, In Hot Water: Inside the Battle to Save the Great Barrier Reef. It covers the history of the Great Barrier Reef over the last 100 years. In the context of my personal journey, taking on the head of the agency that really does all the scientific, or most of the key scientific long-term monitoring on the Great Barrier Reef. and does science on reefs around the world, including that study, by the way, that you showed with the vertical red lines, which are the heating episodes on coral reefs around the world. Those are global heating episodes in red, and you can just see when those come, they're more frequent, and of course, it's having its impact on reefs. But one of the things that I talk about in my book, Adam, as you know, is a talk a little bit about the fact that conversations require, in my opinion, some sort of a shared basis of facts, some sort of agreed set of information that allows the conversation to move forward. Would you mind commenting a little bit on that and the impediments that sometimes are put in place where people aren't sort of on the same page in terms of what's actually going on? Is it possible to have conversations with people who have a different set of quote facts or their own view on their own opinions of what's going on?
Look, I think it certainly is, Paul, but it's like any negotiation. You know, some things you hold very strong and others you can change your mind, particularly if there's really good peer-reviewed science behind it. And then, yeah, you talk about it and then talk about who can do what. I think one of the real challenges, though, is science is often quite complicated, and the general public often wants something, you know, really simple or very synthesized. And sometimes you lose the detail in that way.
Yeah. So we've got a question coming up from Jennifer Marahasi. And so it flows on from, I guess, from what we were just saying. So I'm keen to know why Adam mentioned coral bleaching as well as cyclones equally as being damaging to John Brewer Reef, as does Paul Hardisty in his new book. It was my observation that John Brewer very quickly recovered from the 2022 bleaching, but much of the reef, especially the reef crust, was absolutely devastated. The impacts of the cyclone was devastating to what had been a reef nearing climax with almost 100% coral cover across the reef crest. So that was her question, Adam.
Thanks, Jennifer. And yes, I have been very lucky to be out on a boat with Jennifer and do some filming with her. And my main expertise on John Brewer Reef has been citizen science and recording species of fish and coral. I have done some surveys using a range of methods, but I'm not an expert on attributing which impact has been the most. I was just trying to say that a number of impacts have accumulated there, from coral bleaching, crown of thorns starfish, and most recently the cyclones have done some damage. And I acknowledge that some of these reefs will recover before they're damaged again.
Yep, absolutely. So again, anybody else who wants to join the conversation? Oh, here's somebody else. Fantastic. So Cherie and Mick have said, thanks for your insights, Adam. Can you expand on how you measure the influence and impact of your conversations?
So look, that's a great question. And often you do it in terms of number of people or reach of social media. But then there's also the quality aspect. You know, if you spend a fair bit of time with one person, such as an intern or a staff member, then you can change their life. You know, they might decide to be a scientist or a citizen scientist or make their life's work do something sustainability. So it is a bit imprecise, and hence I showed quite a number of different metrics at the start of the talk. But I will say again, it's all about people and it's about reach. And I wish that my reach was more than 800,000 or 10 million, because we've got 8 billion people on the planet. So I'm only reaching a small number of people, and I wish there was another 1,000 or another million of me who could really get the message out there in different ways that would connect with people, so that we would talk more about the reefs than football.
Yeah, Thanks, Adam. Great answer. I mean, I feel the same way, right? I mean, you write a book and a few people read it, but far, far, far more, infinitely more people won't read it than will. And so, one has to do the best one can. At least I'm going to be going to a book club tomorrow morning and talking about In Hot Water here in Perth. So it'll be maybe a dozen people, but again, it's small conversations about the issue, and maybe a few of those people will never really have thought about the issue and what they can do about it specifically before. And so it just happens one at a time, doesn't it? A few people at a time, small groups, and you've always been really good at that, Adam. So next one is somebody else has said, "Oh, more nice maps." So that was just a comment. Use more nice maps. Ilana, apologies if I didn't pronounce your name correctly, Wolchinski, says, "Thanks for a great session, Adam. I'm so inspired by Reef Ecologic's work, and I'm honored to have spent time as an intern there with you." Okay, great. I'm curious, what qualities do you believe are most critical for leaders in the reef conservation space, and how can those in leadership roles inspire others to take meaningful action?
So great question. And look, just a bit of context on Alana. We have about 100 applications a year for interns. We take 4. And you would think that we would generally take scientists, but sometimes we've taken engineers. Alana's the first journalism student that we've ever taken. And she came over for a month. We took her to the Ocean Film Festival and said, "Your goal while you're here is to make a film." So Alana made a quite amazing film called Ocean Sentinels about her experience diving the reef. She interviewed people from Gabrumpa, interviewed me, interviewed traditional owners. The link is in my talk. I'd encourage you to read it or find it on YouTube. And look, in terms of qualities for leaders, I think it really does vary over time. One of the leaders you talk about in your book, Paul, is John Boost. And this man was an artist, and he was referred to as the bastard from Dingle Bay because he basically made so much noise and got a couple of people offside. But without him and his leadership style and his ability to collaborate with other people who perhaps had softer communication skills, we wouldn't have had the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park that we have today. So I think the skills vary. If I look at, your leadership style, Paul, and some of the others in senior positions, I think things like humility, curiosity, generosity, but also accountability. One of the things that I think you said to me is, as a leader, you look after your team first and foremost, which is absolutely fantastic. And that's something that I aspire to do as well.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And yeah, actually, I think it's so important that in the book In Hot Water, I actually devote several pages of one of the key chapters to leadership and general thoughts on what makes good leaders in this area. So great question, and great to hear more about Ilana and her story. And I urge everyone to maybe, Ilana, if you could put up the link in the chat to your film, that'd be great. And maybe others who are interested could have a watch. I certainly would do that myself. No more questions yet. So Adam, what I'd be interested in exploring a little bit is that, again, in my book, I talk about courage as something that is needed because it's pretty scary. You mentioned in your talk that some of the things that we're having to come face to face with now are pretty confronting. This diverse set of impacts on reefs, the overarching juggernaut that is climate change. I don't know if anyone saw, but the latest issue of the Australian Institute of Company Directors magazine is all about environmental and social governance. And I was just reading it before we got on, and they've identified now that climate change impacts that, Australian companies, for instance, and organizations that are run by boards are woefully unprepared for the impacts, the physical impacts that climate change is going to have on their businesses and on their organizations in the next 20 to 30 years. So it isn't just reefs, right? These conversations matter. And but on the other, but they're also they can be very difficult, and they can be very confronting for people. And so there's this element of being brave enough to be the ones like you are, Adam, to stand up and have these conversations. And maybe that is one of the characteristics of leadership. But could you maybe expound a little bit on how you see that? How do you have difficult conversations? And
Look, you start by setting a time and a place and having a bit of an agenda and just talking to someone and being persistent and setting a goal and having a team of people around you that are supportive and have good ideas. And I'll also do a shout out to one other intern. We had an intern from Florida, Megan Fraser, and she was the one who helped us write our integrated management system and also suggested that we join B Corps. So I've got huge respect for the youth and the young generation and the people that are learning now. You know, you'd think I'd talk to a lot of 60-year-olds in my age group, and I do a bit, but it's the youth and people from different lifestyles and jobs that can come up with some innovative ideas. You know, I'm married to an artist, and she gives me a whole new insight into life that allows me to be a bit more complete than just a scientist.
thanks, Adam. And just for everybody, if you follow the chat, Ilana has put up a link to her film Ocean Sentinels there. It's on YouTube. So definitely have a watch. Thanks for that, Ilana. So I'm gonna move now to the Museum of Underwater Art. Adam, when I first heard about this, I have to admit I was fairly skeptical. I was the CEO of Ames at the time. I wasn't sure what impact it might have and what where it might go, but I did go out and have a look at it with you, and it is pretty spectacular. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit more about how you've seen that? I mean, people are going and they're talking about it, but how are people linking the sculptures with the types of conversations we want to have to change the world, right? That's the topic today. How is that happening?
So the key is that art really does connect with 99% of people, whereas science and engineering, you know, it's seen as a little bit nerdish, and it's more of a minority that connect to that. So the Museum of Underwater Art used the world's best underwater sculpture, a guy called Jason DeCaires Taylor. He has a global following of, they say, 1 billion people on social media. So we wanted to come up with something that interested people, that would perhaps encourage them to go out to see it and the Great Barrier Reef. And the artificial reef is right next to a really fantastic natural reef. And it's about telling stories about the reef and telling stories about the people. So the artist has created these biomorphic sculptures of, you know, some of my other heroes, like Professor Charlie Veron, who's also known as the godfather of coral. And that allows a lot more people through snorkeling and scuba diving to go, well, who's that? What did he do? Etc. So that's the beauty of it. It's an attraction, but it's also a museum, which has connotations for where we put things that we value. It's beautiful. And most importantly, it gets people talking about it. And although the key piece is out at John Brewer Reef, there's also another very visible piece that when you're walking along the strand, it's called the Ocean Siren. And that's a young Indigenous girl that changes colour according to some of the data from Ames, the water temperature data. And again, that gets people talking about science, traditional knowledge, art, culture, climate change, other stuff. So we're proud of that. Townsville is still the cowboys' town, but over time, I think we're starting to get a lot more conversations about the reef and its importance.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And of course, once the much anticipated Reef HQ gets built, which has just been funded by the federal government, and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority gets that happening, there'll be, you know, another keystone feature in Townsville that's really focused on the Great Barrier Reef, making it a bit of a, you know, reef hub to maybe rival Cairns in some way, certainly the science hub, whereas Cairns might be the tourist hub. So that'll be an interesting development, because a lot of that, the Museum of Underwater Art, a lot of it's closer to Townsville really than to Cairns, isn't it?
Absolutely. And look, we'd love to and are having conversations with Reef HQ about collaboration and storytelling. It's much better to work together than to compete. So there's hopefully some really good stories coming into the future.
Adam, there's another question from Jennifer Marhasi, and she's saying, as one of the best coral reef fish biologists in the world, she wants to know whether you think, which specific fish species you see as being most impacted by climate change on the GBR.
Jennifer, I'm not the best coral reef fish scientist. I'm just an enthusiastic citizen scientist. And thank you. I have enjoyed our ongoing conversations. And look, it seems like the species that rely most on coral, such as the butterfly fishes and some of the damsel fishes, might be some of the most impacted by climate change. But there's dozens of scientists that are working in this field on coral tolerance. So we will see some changes, small and large, according to, you know, fish communities, and we'll just continue to monitor them and tell the stories over time.
Thanks, Adam. Comment from Max Newlands. He says, thanks, Adam and Paul. Good to hear how you connect leadership, citizen science, and art in your barrier reef work. And thank you so much for that comment. I think it's a hard thing to do. And, you know, I've had a number of conversations with scientists, and Adam, you know, we have together with people who are professional scientists and doing this full time. And there is a hesitancy among many scientists to, in any way, go beyond just presenting the scientific information. Right? It's completely, they feel that, and we're scientists, we're trained that way. I'm an engineer, but it's the same thing. Dispassionate, facts only, and the interpretation, policy, et cetera, is for others to do. And yet, what we need to do, what we're finding is that approach alone isn't working, because if it had, then the last 40 years of effort would have resulted in better conservation outcomes overall.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And thanks, Max. And Max used to work at James Cook Uni and has now moved to a very senior position in Canberra. But I was very privileged that Max was able to join us on a leadership course up here in Townsville with the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation. And I think that's been one of my real life lessons, just how impactful and how you see the world differently if you do a leadership course or if you do read about it. You know, it took me 7 years to do my PhD, but doing a 1-year leadership course was much more valuable to my development than a PhD. And it taught me that it's all about people. Yep, the numbers are important. Yes, the science is important, but it's all about people and your relationships and your conversations.
Yeah, great answer. Question from Margie Atkinson. Adam, are you finding that with everything else going on in the world, from the cost of living to increasing political instability and war, are people more or less willing to have conversations about the reef than they were maybe a few years ago? And are you finding that people are more responsive to the art and the storytelling angles of the reef or to the science?
Great question, Margie. And we used to work together at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority a long time ago. So it's so lovely to have so many people whose names I know joining this conversation. It depends who you're talking to, but I'm finding a much bigger uptake with the storytelling, and an even bigger uptake if you can get people out on the reef and you can get them underwater and you can show them things and they can ask questions and they can make up their own minds. I think that's extremely powerful for people at all ages, youth to older people. So a lot of our conferences now or events, we often try and build in a field day, and we try and even build it in before rather than as an afterthought, just because it's so important to have that experience.
Yeah, and Margie, we've never met, but the addition that I would make here is that that's part of the reason I've started writing, popular nonfiction, but also fiction, because people love stories, and if you can inject the ideas, the themes, and the science into a ripping good story that people want to watch or read, then you can get things across that you never would otherwise. And people would pick that up and read it who never would otherwise. So the two novels that were mentioned at the beginning, Forcing, which is about a near future where youth takes over. They're exasperated by the lack of action by the elder generation. Climate change is biting hard. They take power with unforeseen circumstances. And then the follow-up is called The Descent. And those two books have had way more impact and had far more readers than any of the peer-reviewed journals or textbooks that I ever wrote. So I think that tells me something as well. But on the other hand, I couldn't write it authoritatively if I hadn't had the scientific background in the first place. And so we need both, right? You need the facts, you need the science, but you need the storytelling as well. People like Adam who can bridge the gulf, then they're so much better off. So we're getting down to the end of the time we have. We have a few more minutes. If anybody else has any additional comments, just seeing there's no additional questions so far. So Adam, I'm just going to ask you then, as maybe a final thought before we wrap up. You talk about impact, right? And we're talking about conversations. So in your view, what are some of the things that people should think about when they want to turn these conversations, helping people turn conversations into action? So what can people do?
Look, if I go back to a range of metrics, and I don't want to complicate it, but one of the things is PESTLE, political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. I think politics is so important. And one of the things people can do is contact their local, state, and federal politician and/or prime minister. Most of those big environmental decisions happen at a national level. Tell them who you are, tell them your story, tell them you care about the Great Barrier Reef, and tell them what you are doing. So that's one. And, we've got some voting coming up in Queensland, so it'd be interesting to see who is the best party. But I think you've also got to lead by example. A lot of people are talking about 2030 or even 2050. That's a bloody long way away. We need to do things much more quickly, and we need to prioritize them. And there's some good programs out there, and there's a hell of a lot of conservation groups that if you can't do it yourself, you can support them, with a bit of money or a bit of time, which is fantastic. You can tonight or tomorrow do your ecological footprint. When I first did mine, it was 2.1 planets. Now, once I had a measure, I was able to look what my biggest contributors were, and I've got it down to 1.8. Maybe in 3 or 5 years' time, it'll get down to 1.5. So measure something, think about it, and take some actions. But I guess the key thing is also tell other people about this talk, share the YouTube link. Let's get the message out there that there's people that care and are doing some good stuff. And let's try and have I hate to say a blue army, but we need more people, sharing their stories, writing books, making films, talking to school kids about the reef and the planet and the future, and keeping everyone else accountable. It's not about money. It's about a healthy planet for us and future generations. And at the moment, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority is saying the state of the world's best managed coral reef is poor. That makes me embarrassed to be an Australian. We need to collectively have a good, if not a great barrier reef, and do everything we can in small ways to mobilise and make some difference. That's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I'm really passionate that
that's a great
everyone's
one.
got to do something.
That's a great answer. And look, I've just got some other, Margie said, thanks for a great session, thought-provoking. Do you think, the question here from Steve Fisher, do you think it was the correct decision not to list the GBR in danger by UNESCO? I'm going to let Adam answer, and then I'm going to give my answer.
Yes and no, I'm going to go, Paul. Yes, it was a good decision for politicians. Yes, it was a good decision for the tourism industry. But no, I think for conservationists, I think it was if it was listed in danger, we would have had to have done a lot more and a lot more urgently. And I think we've probably just deferred the decision for a couple of years. Interesting to hear what you say.
Well, in my book, I go through this in some detail because one of the chapters is about the whole, World Heritage listing, the history of the listing, and then the subsequent monitoring. But I actually argued when I was the CEO to the government that actually, if there are 27 coral reef systems around the world that are on the World Heritage list, and if climate change is the biggest threat to the GBR and to coral reefs around the world, which it is, and they're going to list the Great Barrier Reef as in danger, then they can't just list the GBR. They need to list all of the 27 reefs on the World Heritage list because it's the same threat. If they do that, then because they always say that listing in danger is a way of drawing attention to governments, that they need to do more. So if you wanted to get people's attention, which is their stated purpose of the in danger listing, then that would get the attention and it would be scientifically defensible. But it isn't scientifically defensible to put only the GBR on the list, if you see what I mean. So that's my argument. Okay, we got one more final question, and then we are going to wrap it up. Charlene, thanks so much for this nice session. I will contact some of you soon because I'm doing a PhD at UQ on social marine science and how families and children experience ecological impacts or ecological grief due to climate change impacts of the GBR. I'm happy to give you more information. Contact you. You do great work. Thank you. So I'm sure, Charlene, both I and Adam would be delighted to talk to you. So please reach out to us and you can get our contact details through the Royal Geographic Society of Queensland, who have hosted this wonderful event tonight. And I'm going to pass over back to our host if he wants to conclude or say any final words. We're wrapping up. It's 28 minutes after.
No, thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Adam. That has been an insightful and fascinating discussion tonight. I'd like to, on behalf of everyone, thank you for your conversations this evening and thank everyone for attending as well. We will be releasing the recording of this session in the coming days, so please do keep an eye out on the socials and email comms. With that, though, we'll wrap up for this evening. Thank you, everyone, again for coming, and we'll sure see many of you at another event very soon.
See you, everyone. Thanks, Adam. Good job.
Thanks, Paul. Real pleasure. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.